We couldn't start with anyone but Janice. She's going to kick off our final session of the year, followed by Rich and then Alexandra. So Janice will give us the introduction to the book.
Thank you very much, Ajay. And boy, what a pleasure to talk about this book. I just got the introduction, which is really frustrating because I don't want to give away the surprise as we go along. But this is a really big book that asks big questions about the biggest issues of our time. David Chalmers starts out by telling us that, of course, current virtual reality technologies are still at an early stage. We know that. You can't touch a virtual surface yet. And as he says, we can't smell a virtual flower or taste a virtual glass of wine. But these are temporary limitations. The technology will improve to a point where we can simulate people with simulated brains and bodies. Now, this gets us to the first big question of the book. When the technology improves, David asks, how will we know that right now all of us are not in a virtual world simulated by a computer? This, the simulation hypothesis, which runs through this whole book, suggests that what seems to be an ordinary physical world could be a simulated world. So the central argument of the book, virtual realities are genuine, real. So what happens in the virtual world really happens. Stronger claim, you can lead a fully meaningful life in a virtual world, reality plus. The world we're living in right now could be a virtual world. It's possible, think about that. And virtual and augmented minds are genuine minds. Now, the second big argument this big book makes, and here's one of the surprises, thinking about virtual reality technology helps us think about the external world in new ways and allows us to make some big and important claims about the reality of the world around us. And as we're thinking about this, David tells us we are doing techno-philosophy, where philosophy helps to shed light on new questions about technology, but technology also helps to open up new space for older questions in philosophy. I was asked what was surprising. The first, and it turns out smaller surprise to me, was the argument that we cannot know that we are not in a simulation. I don't know about you. That one really made me stop and look around and check to taste that I could actually taste that glass of wine I was drinking. The bigger claim that this book makes, and this is a big one, is that reality exists independently of us. Explanation yields structure, and structure yields reality. And in an age of multiple realities and multiple truth claims, there is an objective reality and objective truth. Who would have thought that by exploring virtual reality, we would affirm that? That is a take your breath away, strong claim.
Janice, thank you very much. Moving into chapter 1, is this the real life? Rich?
I couldn't do this without doing some slides because it was so hard to figure this out. So I'm just going to show you my thoughts in the real world, if that's okay with everybody.
Let's do it, Rich.
All right, here we go. Okay, let me just summarize in 2 minutes what the chapter is and then what I found surprising. Fortunately, Queen is one of my favorite rock groups, so I thought the name of this was perfect, very appropriate, which is it the real life or is it not? The chapter actually has 3 big questions, which is it real or is it not? And the supposition that we'll hear more about is it's actually unknowable whether or not this is a real world or not, which made me a little depressed. And then the second thing is, if it's virtual, does it really exist? So if we're all living in a simulation, does it actually matter? And then the final thing is a good life possible if it's all, let's say, fake? That is, if it doesn't really matter. Now, it's easy to summarize. I have to tell you, this chapter blew my mind. I've listened to the book probably twice now because it's so interesting, but it really made me think a lot about the nature of our reality. Am I just really a statue lying in the middle of the desert with a bunch of moss on it, pretending I'm in Zoom, or vice versa? I have to tell you, my first reaction to this was, it just made me feel life is incredibly meaningless. And this whole session seems to be designed around this, because can we get smaller? You know, we're one of 7.5 billion people. I looked all this up. There's 32 billion years to go, years left to go in the known universe's life. So what does my 80 or whatever years mean? There's 225 billion to 2 trillion galaxies in a simulated world in the known universe. There's 100 million stars per galaxy. And then I got to read about Sean Carroll. He tells me not only that, but that entire world is dividing 5,000 times per second into new quantum realms on every quantum event. And then, of course, we've got multiverses beyond the known universes and multiverses in multidimensional space. So I think the only thing I felt is that we're really pretty insignificant. It's all pretty meaningless. I'm not really sure why I'm in this book club. The thing that really made me think about was how hard it is to make these estimates of likelihoods, particularly when we're talking about all these exponential increases. The third thing is, you know, if everything really is conscious, it really made me realize I should probably be a vegan. And particularly there's a chapter that will come up, I'm sure, soon about if animals are conscious. I think the fourth thing it made me think about is I do visit my parents every day. My dad passed away, but both have severe Alzheimer's, and I can literally watch their consciousness drift away and slip away. So it really made me realize that there are levels of consciousness, that it's not just you're a complete being all at once, but it does fade and come back again. One thing that crossed my mind is David uses Second Life as an example, where people get together and have these virtual worlds. And it occurred to me, well, Zoom is sort of an artificial reality too, because we're all bringing organics together, e.g. us. But I think what he's really talking about are these non-player roles, if we can even tell who's non-player or not. The final thing it made me realize, because this is a slide deck I just done about changes, but in essence, you can never really know whether or not this is the world we live in and I'm dreaming of this, or vice versa. And that just made me realize that, at least for me, the only thing that really matters is, I think it's just in our nature to keep struggling anyway. Probably all the people who gave up are all, you know, they all died. So maybe this is all to say that despite all the hopelessness of being in a simulation, in a virtual world and so forth, that it is in our nature to struggle and to work and to try to make things meaningful. Thank you very much.
Rich, thank you for that uplifting interpretation. We'll move to Alexandra for chapter 2. What is the simulation hypothesis?
Thank you, Jay. And it's so funny because I must be the positive bookend to that conversation because, you know, in my life, I spend a lot of time reading, but I also love video games and movies. And I've never had to rely on deep knowledge of modern sort of movies like Matrix and Free Guy, or even playing anything from some of those more complicated games down to thinking about Tetris and Pac-Man as micro models of virtual simulated realities. And so think about the Pac-Man movie that came out based on that game and the rich possibilities that people imagined. And so to understand this chapter well, you have to have watched a whole bunch of the movies, and he uses them with superb sort of expertise to illustrate complicated concepts. A lot of definitions in chapter 2. So if you're not sure what you're reading in a subsequent chapter, go to the glossary and look it up because the definitions are really important. And so starting with the concept that computer simulations are not the first simulations we've ever had. Before that, we had mechanical simulations. Anyone remember doing the planets and sun and earth as a kid will know that we're now doing that with more sophisticated models to predict stellar events. But the thing that blew me away in this chapter is that thought experiments are just as powerful. So each one of us individually can simulate worlds in our heads and imagine all kinds of things and play around with concepts that computers right now can't possibly create. The other big aha process was within all of these simulation, the way they would use the words, you can have imperfect and perfect. You can have them be global or local. They can be open-ended or closed so that the end is predictable. They can be representation of the world the way it is. And then, 4 levels apart, they could be a representation of a completely imaginary world where none of the rules that exist on Earth apply. And so within all of these different constructs, they allow us to isolate certain components and ask ourselves hard questions. And the hardest questions of all, and that was actually written in the book, is the whole question that if we are to simulate a human brain or a human entity, we have to take seriously the idea that the simulated brain is themselves conscious and intelligent, which is very much the question that this very group has grappled from the beginning. If we imagine something that isn't quote unquote real and created in biology, does it have a right to exist? Does it have the same values and rules we give to people with pure consciousness? And so the book was just incredibly interesting from a perspective of imagining how and what we can do in virtual reality that we can't do today, that allows us to imagine where the future is going to live in. And I'm excited about that future.
Alexandra, thank you very much. That was those were the chapters in part 1 of the book, which is on virtual worlds. Every once in a while, somebody advances a line of inquiry that is so foundational that when they push that frontier forward, it reverberates all the way up and affects more or less everything else. And our special guest tonight is one of those people in regards to his contributions to work in consciousness. So I won't repeat his biography because it's already been circulated in advance. You've read it. Just please join me in welcoming to the CDL Reading Group, Professor David Chalmers from NYU. David, nice to have you here.
Great. Well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here. Amazing group you have here.
David, we're going to work our way through the book, but we're going to take a pause here. Anything that you'd like to comment on with regards to just the opening part of the remarks that you heard in the opening parts of the book?
Well, there's so much, and I'm now seeing this is so intense. So many ideas packed into every 3-minute thought piece. Yeah, maybe just one thing from each of you. I think it was Janice who started and said, the biggest surprise was the remarks about believing in objective reality. That was actually super important for me because I was worried that people were going to read this book as saying anything goes, reality is all in the mind, everyone's reality is equally legitimate. I got mine, you got yours. Because you might think that somehow that's what virtual reality is, genuine reality means. Everyone's reality is on a par. And that's actually completely the opposite of what I want to say. Yeah, virtual reality is, I think, genuine reality, but virtual reality is not all in the mind. These are real digital realities outside the mind, actually going on in objective processes in reality. And I think we can get reality right, we can get reality wrong. So I absolutely don't want this Reality Plus book to lead to some kind of, revival of relativism where we all live in our own reality. I think, we live in a shared reality. Right now, we live in a shared physical reality, which may or may not be a virtual reality. We will construct more virtual realities in the future, but I think these are all objective realities. They're multiple realities, but still objective realities. Rich, made so many points. I guess the one that stuck with me especially was the point about meaninglessness, the long list of all the ways in which we're insignificant. Tiny planet and tiny solar system, and it's in a solar system and a galaxy and a multiverse. And so on, I'd add, I'm from Australia, a little country in the southern hemisphere, a long way from everywhere else. And now I add to that yeah, we might just be one reality among the many realities of reality plus. Somehow I find that actually a little bit reassuring. Somehow it turns out it's not quite so bad that we're in this. It makes the idea of being in, say, a simulated world at level 42 of the objective metaverse not quite as insignificant as it might have seemed, because you might say we were already insignificant, or you might say we were already just a tiny part of the universe. And I'd say most of us have come to terms with that. The significance of our life doesn't derive necessarily from our impact on the universe as a whole. We don't have to have cosmic impact for our lives to be meaningful. I think we have subjective impact on our own lives and on the lives of people around us. We have our own purposes, our own local goals, build relationships, build communities, solve problems. And it's this kind of subjective meaning is somehow where the meaning in our life comes from. And I think you can have that. If someone says you can't have that in virtual reality because it's so insignificant, I'll say, well, that means then you can't have it, on Earth in physical reality either, because it's so insignificant. But I'd put it the other way around. I'd say, if you could have it in physical reality, you can also have it in virtual reality. Finally, Alexandra, brought up a number of points, movies, thought experiments. But so the key thing maybe is somehow that simulated brains can be conscious, which I call at the beginning of the book just sort of the fourth main thesis, that virtual minds can be genuine minds. But a lot of people, I think, have come back to this as one of the key theses in the book, because if you don't have that, much of the rest of it doesn't go through. If simulated brains don't have consciousness, then there's something missing in a simulation. But if it turns out that simulated minds can have genuine consciousness, well, I think so much of the meaning in our lives comes from consciousness. So much of our conception of reality comes from consciousness that I think I agree with you that this is really at the core. David,
thank you very much. All right, we're going to press on to the second part of the book, which is the segment on knowledge. Sonia Israel, and then James Cham, and then Isaac. Sonia is going to lead us off with chapter 3 of Do We Know Things?
Yep. So chapter 3 lays the groundwork for unraveling whether it is possible to ever really be certain of what we know or what we think we know. One mode of inquiry to this is skepticism. So one can be skeptical about certain beliefs, like whether the stories in some religious texts are really true, or whether, Justin Trudeau will really do the things he said he would. Global skepticism, on the other hand, is a position that casts doubt on all of our beliefs at once. Chalmers highlights one form of this, that is Cartesian skepticism, specifically Descartes' thought experiment to cast doubt on all of our knowledge of the external world. So Descartes entertained 3 arguments that might annihilate everything we think we know. These included sensory illusions, dreams, and an evil demon. Illusions. The human brain is pretty easily fooled by optical illusions and the like. So who's to say that we aren't being bamboozled by some complex multimodal sensory illusion right now? In the 21st century, this kind of full body illusion might be facilitated by advanced VR technology. Descartes' next argument was about dreams. How do we know that this isn't all just one very long and complex dream? Apparently, dream science has found some pretty good ways to know that when we're dreaming, but how do we know that the science itself wasn't all a dream? Hard to tell. Anyways, while the illusion and dream arguments mostly lead to skepticism of the world around us, they don't pose much threat to pre-existing knowledge like memories or cultural beliefs. So Descartes needed something a little stronger to really threaten his internal world and his ability to reason. So his third argument then proposed the idea of this all-powerful, all-being, and controlling evil demon that is devoted to deceiving us with lifelong manipulation of our perceptions, thoughts, and memories. Chalmers considers the modern equivalent of this a brain in a vat connected to a supercomputer, causing the brain to experience a full and enriching life in a detailed world, ergo the simulation hypothesis and a master argument that goes like this. Since we can't know if we're not in a simulation, we can't definitively know anything about the external world. Ultimately, Descartes landed on the one thing he could really be sure of throughout his entire thought experiment, which was that he was undoubtedly thinking about the fact that he was doubting his entire reality, thus forming the dictum, I think, therefore I am. Or better yet, in Chalmers' words, I am conscious, therefore I am. Now, unfortunately for Professor Chalmers, this to me does highlight the relativity of our reality. Simulated or not, if we're conscious, our pain, suffering, pleasure are real to us. And so as a cosmic nihilist, I do find myself questioning whether or not the absolute truth really matters in the end. And regardless, our brains make complex transformations to process any form of stimuli, internal or external. So I wondered whether this might also count as a form of simulation. If it does, then we might consider consciousness itself to be the truly inescapable simulation in any one of these cases. Thank you so much for a great session, everybody.
Thank you very much, Sonia. James is going to tackle, can we prove there is an external world?
Great. Okay, I'm going to go share a slide here. Let me make sure I have this right. Can everyone see this?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, so can we prove there's an external world? In this chapter, Chalmers goes through 5 questions. Can God solve the problem? Is appearance the same as reality? Is a simulation hypothesis meaningless? Is a simulation hypothesis contradictory? Does simplicity rule out the simulation hypothesis? And is it obvious that we're not in a simulation? And with that, I will remind everyone of Betteridge's law of headlines, which is if there's a rhetorical question in a headline, the answer is always no. Interestingly enough, there's one technique that Chalmers introduces to address many of these questions, which goes to this character called Ludwig, which is this wonderful young baby who lives this life and studies philosophy, thinks about Descartes, sort of believes that appearance is reality, and then sort of has a bunch of commonsensical points of view around sort of why he clearly lives in this world. And then, of course, the reality is that it's all a simulation, that he is plugged in to this terrible endocephalic electro hallucinator, which is this tool that allows him to sort of live as if he's in a mass hallucination for most of his life. There's a reason why this short story is called The Philosopher's Nightmare, because it suggests that the answer to the riposte to many philosophical questions around whether or not we live in a simulation, the answer is, well, what Chalmers calls the simulation riposte, which is, well, I don't know, that's what if you have this complicated argument, let me just ask you, the answer might be, that's what you'd say if you were in a simulation. And so that thought exercise in some ways solves so many of these questions that it's almost unfair. I will note that it solves the first 2 and the last 2 really easily. And the middle 2, it ends up with like a slightly difficult thing. And the most subtle one is this question around, is the simulation hypothesis contradictory? And fortunately, it is so subtle that there's a whole chapter around it. And I'm going to leave it to chapter 20 and hope someone does a great job of explaining it. One reflection, though, is on what I think is the real philosopher's nightmare, which is embedded in the ending of the story, which is at the very end of the story, Ludwig gets his brain transplanted back to his real body, and then he loses all interest in philosophy. And in some ways says, now what? And leaves the story that way. And I think that is actually what haunted me most about this chapter. And I'd be fascinated to hear what Chalmers says about it.
James, thank you very much. And closing out the segment on knowledge, Isaac Tamlin is going to reflect on, is it likely that we are in a simulation?
Thanks. By this point, we've heard about the simulation hypothesis, but we haven't discussed how likely it is. That's the problem that Chapter 5 aims to solve. Let's quantify the likelihood that we are in a simulation. And by quantify, I mean assign some real numbers to the question. Not a yes or a no, but a reasonable probability. In many ways, the chapter reminded me of the Drake equation, which attempts to quantify the number of intelligent civilizations humans might communicate with. Chalmers uses the sim franchise of video games to argue that universal scale simulation is inevitable. He extrapolates our ever-increasing computing power into the future to conclude that there will inevitably be millions to billions of sim universes running in the future. They will be used to study science, history, warfare, the economy, and so on. He also makes the same argument for alien worlds. There's a non-zero chance that aliens will develop sims, and they will be able to simulate many more sims than their own flesh and blood, which I guess will be green, selves can. By sheer numbers, the majority of intelligent entities will be simulated ones. If we estimate that 1 in 10 non-sim populations create at least 1,000 sim populations, then 99% of intelligent beings are going to be sims, and we are probably in that simi group. You can play with those numbers a bit, obviously, but clearly there's a non-trivial chance that we are sims, and it may even be likely. The rest of the chapter is devoted to breaking down the inevitable objections. It would be too difficult. Non-sims won't bother. They might think it's unethical. We are somehow special. The world is too detailed, and so on and so on. Some of these objections he classifies as sim blockers. Too difficult, intelligent sims are impossible, non-sims will choose not to make them. Sim blockers include the non-commutability of certain problems, which he debunks in a way which I agree with, the high energy cost of simulating human-level intelligence, again, I think this is reasonably washed away, and the computability of the universe. I was less convinced here, for the record. And then the darker thought that non-sims will destroy themselves before they get a chance to make sims. This last one can be countered by tweaking the math a little bit, though. For example, rather than estimating, say, 1 in 10 non-sim populations, we say it's 1 in 1,000 who survive to make sims. Basically, if there are no sim blockers, the 99% math holds. The possibility of sim signs is also addressed. Perhaps there are signatures of being a sim, and the lack or presence of them in our life is a clue. We don't often see glitches in the matrix, so okay, maybe we're not sims, but we do live in the early stages of the universe and with no other known life, which would be easier to simulate, so that kind of points towards the sim direction. We haven't started making sims yet, so that's a good sign that we're sims, and some of us are interesting though, so that might mean that we're sims. Consciousness could also be a non-sim sign if consciousness is non-simulatable. Chalmers argues that it is, and I agree with him. The size of the universe is also raised. One might imagine a simulated universe would be relatively small. If you're only focused on a small planet of sims, why bother with all this extra space? In the end, Chalmers ascribes some more estimates to the 2 types of sim blockers he identifies. Human-like sims are impossible, and a few human-like populations will make sims. Numbers like 50% get thrown around. Tying these values to the previous 99 gets you to something like 25% chance that we're sims. Whether the correct number is 10%, 25%, or more, the point is that it's non-zero, which is definitely saying something. He concludes that we cannot know whether or not we are in a simulation.
Excellent. Isaac, I wasn't sure if you're going to try and tackle the math, and you did. Thank you for that. That is the roundup of the part 2 on knowledge. David, whatever you'd like to comment on.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the part of the book where we really start to bring in some traditional philosophy, Descartes' problem, how can we know anything about the external world? And to make the case that the simulation idea really affects that. First, to go through some traditional ideas, and second, to see how the simulation hypothesis bears on it. Yeah, so Sonia was talking about Descartes' skeptical argument, and I was particularly interested by her apologetic thought that, for me, reality is subjective because my reality is consciousness. And of course, something like that is at the heart of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He's saying my consciousness, I can know that at least one thing is real, my thinking, my consciousness, therefore I can know that I exist. And I completely agree with Descartes and with Sonia about this. I think consciousness is as real a thing as there is. I would say actually that consciousness has objective reality, and it's part of objective reality. This is kind of paradoxical because consciousness is a form of subjectivity, but I would say subjectivity is objectively real. It's not up to any of us that consciousness exists. It's just an objective fact about reality that is there. I would just go a little bit further to say it's probably not the only part of reality. Certainly, my consciousness is not the only part of reality. All of you are conscious too, and I think there's a reality out there beyond our consciousness, namely physical reality, that helps to explain, the common patterns in all of our consciousness and so on. I mean, there are worldviews on which all reality involves some element of consciousness. Maybe the common reality we're all experience is God's mind or a single cosmic mind. Super interesting view in its own right. But I would say consciousness itself is too objective reality. James was talking about the simulation riposte and how it bears on how you can respond to there's this long tradition of people responding to the skeptic about the external world, saying we can know we're not a brain in a vat for this reason, for that reason. We can know we're not in a simulation. And then I say, yeah, but that's what somebody in a simulation would say. And that kind of takes down some of these responses. Yeah, but there was a lot of this actually comes from this wonderful little known short story by Jonathan Harrison, 1966, The Philosopher's Nightmare, where Ludwig goes through all these stages himself, reads Descartes, reads Berkeley, reads G.E. Moore, says, I have hands, therefore the world exists, and he's in a simulation. But yeah, James reminded me of the final part of the book where he gets a body and loses interest in philosophy. Now, Dad, why did that happen? James was now fully appreciating, Ludwig was now fully appreciating his situation for the first time. I was a brain in a vat and I couldn't tell. And now look at me, now I have a body. And you would think now he would really be asking the question, gosh, could I still be a brain in a vat? Could I be in a bigger vat that the other brain was in? The first 50 years of my life were in a vat and now finally I've escaped. This is exactly what I think Neo should have thought when he took the red pill. Why was he so confident that he had reached the physical world? He should have, now he knows all about the matrix. He should be more worried. Same for Ludwig. And Isaac brings up, yeah, this kind of quantificational element, the Drake equation-like feature of making the case that we're in a simulation. A lot of this comes from Nick Bostrom, who put forward his own equation for what percentage of beings in the universe will be simulated. I think Bostrom leaves some things out, which I try and work in there. But I like this idea of trying to quantify it. I mean, the figure I give at the end, 25% probability that we're in a simulation. I can't say I can support that rigorously. I derive that from, well, I'm 50% possible, that 50% confident myself that a certain kind of simulation is possible, 50% confident myself that if that's possible, people will create many of them. I can't justify those figures rigorously. I'd say for me, they're just reports of my own subjective probabilities here. Other people might assign somewhat different numbers and maybe thereby come out at 10% or 1% or whatever. But I do think it at least makes a case that this is a hypothesis that we have to actually take seriously as a realistic hypothesis. And once you do that, I think it really has major impact on these questions about knowledge.
David, thanks very much. We're going to press on now to the third segment on reality. Chris Hatfield will begin with, and then followed by Avery and then Hong. Chris will tackle what is reality.
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. Thanks, Dave. This is pretty key. What is reality? And can you define it? And can you then have a checklist to look for it? The premise is that physical reality is the only thing that's real, and virtual reality is not real. That's one premise. But David counters that with a sort of virtual realism, that virtual reality is a general reality and virtual objects are real and not an illusion. So looking at the fundamental premise. And that means he also accepts something he calls simulation realism, or virtual digitalism. And the idea that the trees and cars and humans aren't made up of atoms. Instead, they're made up of bits. And that means that the next world up is a computer, metaphorically speaking. But that doesn't make the digital objects less or more real or less real. So how to define reality then? Everything that's physical and everything that's virtual, number one. Number two, a complete interconnected physical or virtual space. And number three, the property of being real, which I find a little bit circular. But here's his 5 definitions they uses for a reality checklist, if you're wondering if something is real or not. Number one, reality as an existence, like Joe Biden is real, Santa Claus is not, a mirage is not. Reality is causal power. Does it affect something or can it be affected? Reality is mind independence. It doesn't depend on any one's mind for existence. Number 4, reality is non-illusoriness, meaning that things are roughly as we believe them to be. And number 5, reality as genuineness. Is this a real thing? Like, a fake Rolex, as a silly example. But when you try that out on a perfect simulation, then it passes as being real. So the simulation hypothesis then can be looked at through a metaphysical lens, and that is that being digital is sort of like just being quantum mechanical and in equal levels of complexity and confusion. But to me, this was kind of the most interesting line of the whole chapter 6, and that is molecules are made of atoms, atoms are made of quarks, and quarks are made of bits, which I found kind of intriguing. What about the simulator? And it's analogous, I think, as it's crossed everybody's mind, to a god. If the simulation hypothesis is right, then the physical world is made of bits, and a creator created the physical world by arranging those bits. And yeah, I'm equally curious to what David was just saying of what is thought, because I see thought as my simulation of everything. My body's just a vehicle. If I stop thinking, then I'm just on life support. My body's just, meat processing fluids. But the very fundamental essence of me is thought, but I don't really know what thought is.
Chris, thank you very much. Avery is going to tackle Is God a Hacker in the Next Universe Up?
Thank you. Yes, Chapter 7 of Professor Chalmers' book is titled by this question: Is God a hacker in the next universe up? In this chapter, Chalmers starts by reviewing historic arguments for God's existence, including St. Anselm's notion that any God, if perfect, would at least have the courtesy to exist. Chalmers turns from such late medieval QEDs to his own agenda, sketching out a simulation theology. On page 135, Chalmers describes his long affinity to atheism and a naturalism that rejects the supernatural. Yet with this simulation hypothesis, Chalmers feels at last he has found a God that even a naturalist can believe in. Yet Chalmers asks, do we really want to found a religion around our simulator? Chalmers' aversion to religion is expressed in his statement that I do not think any being is worthy of worship. Chalmers' definition of this theology without worship entails, quote, the study of the simulator as God from the point of view of those within the simulation. Not only is it presumed that no being is worthy of worship, but equally, quote, we should take seriously the possibility that our creator is ignoring us. Should we try to call out to this simulator God, a God unworthy of our worship, but at least having the courtesy to exist? Chalmers reasons that, quote, if our simulator is an artificial intelligence who has designed a batch of watertight simulations and isn't paying attention, then our efforts may be vain. Here then is what I find intriguing. If this AI simulator is unworthy of worship, but worthy of theology, what changes if the AI God is not merely a creator, but rather a hacker in the next universe up? After all, the title of this chapter posits a hacker. As many at this event are probably familiar, the first entities termed hackers were those local demiurges at MIT who go by the name graduate students. In 1963, these mischief makers hacked the university telephone system by getting the PDP-1 mainframe to dial successive phone lines until receiving a dial tone, indicating a line out from which to make free long-distance calls. Professors grumpily reporting on these exploits in the MIT student paper at the time referred to the hackers' use of esoteric methods and brute force techniques. Could the simulator God be a professor irritated at how the hacker gods have tied up the system? The 1963 newspaper story on this campus fiasco quotes an accomplished hacker who stresses evolving techniques, saying, the field is always open to experimentation. Perhaps this is the place where hacker gods and we hacker sims doing theology have something in common. What looks like tying up the phone lines may be experiments in finding a line out or in. Long distance mischief and two-way theology, heretical adoration even we hackers can believe in. Thanks.
Thank you, Avery. A line out and a line in, it's coming. Hong is going to bring us home with, is the universe made of information?
Thanks. So chapter 8, title is the universe made of information? So the chapter asks this question, is everything in our universe ultimately a pattern of bits? So this is so-called it from bit hypothesis. So what does the hypothesis mean? It posits that everything in the physical world around us can be mapped to a sequence of bits. A sequence of bits consists of binary digits that are arranged into certain structures according to certain algorithms. And this is what David calls structural information. So essentially everything we can experience in the physical world, like my chairs, my table, and my cats, can be mapped to a sequence of bits. And things that we cannot physically touch or see, like electrons or quarks, can also be mapped to a sequence of bits. And there is an equivalence between the laws of physics and algorithms. And I think that even though the chapter does not discuss this, but I suspect that when I think about consciousness or emotions or interactions, social connections between people, probably can also be mapped to a sequence of bits, because of, if we think of them as chemical reactions of body and mind. So is the universe actually made of bits, which is the title question? I don't think by the end of the chapter I know the answer, and that makes me a little bit frustrated because I really want to know the answer. But from the author's perspective, all he needs for his argument is that this remains a possibility. It doesn't need to be true. But I think it is an interesting thought experiment because it obviously has this linkage with the simulation hypothesis. So the author ends the chapter by discussing two types of framework. One is to whether bits per se can be thought of as the fundamental layers or fundamental elements of the universe, or bits have to be further embedded into some physical substrates like punch cards or mechanical switches or transistors, etc. And the author wrote that the former hypothesis that the bits themselves are the fundamental elements of the universe are a bit difficult to understand. And I smiled a bit when I was reading this sentence because for me, the whole book is quite difficult and radical to understand. So I can't quite tell whether this, what are the qualitative differences between these, whether bits themselves are the fundamental elements. So I'm very curious to learn about like whether there are qualitative differences in terms of what kind of implications that we can draw from these two different kinds of hypotheses. So, but ultimately, the author concludes that we don't really need none of this. This also doesn't really matter. All we need is that there is an equivalence between, so everything in the physical world, we can find an equivalence to mathematical representation. So I felt like by reading a few chapters, I'm only seeing trees, not the forest. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the rest of the chapter, especially hearing about how these thought experiments are applied to the VR technology as well as the economy that are made of virtual realities. Thank you.
Hong, thank you very much. That was the segment on reality. David, whatever you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, thanks for all those thoughts. I guess I think of this book as having a kind of a bad news, good news structure. You know, bad news, we might be in a simulation. You might think that's terrible. Yeah, can't rule that out. It may even be likely. So part two is the bad news. I think of this part three, is more of the good news. It's like, hey, if we're in a simulation, it's not so bad. Things are still real. You know, maybe there's a God, maybe the world is made of bits, but actually it can all be real. But yeah, this brings in all these questions about reality, God, information. Chris was, raising these ideas about maybe consciousness is the simulation. Our thought, in a way, is our simulation. I agree with that to some extent. I agree that, you know, our consciousness is a very big part of our reality. But I guess I'd be inclined to say our consciousness is not a self-standing simulation. Our consciousness runs on inputs from outside our consciousness, whether it's a physical world or a computer simulation. We need something outside our consciousness to run that simulation. I mean, it could be like the dream hypothesis. Maybe our consciousness is interacting with a simulated world of our own creation, as in the dream world, or it could be a cosmic consciousness. But either way, we need something outside our own consciousness for our consciousness to interact with. And that raises the really interesting question as to whether that would be real. I'd say it would be real, but that might, on the other hand, also be in some sense all in the mind, which would conflict with one criteria of the reality checklist, which is being not just all in the mind. So if we do turn out to be just in a dream, then maybe we get to have 4 out of 5 on the reality score. And likewise, if consciousness is all there is in our simulation. Avery was raising questions about, God and the thinking of the simulator. The simulator doesn't seem like a full-scale God, not all good, not worth raising a whole religion around, but maybe at least has the status of a demiurge, like a local crafter or creator. And then raise this question about hackers with this this observation about the hackers at MIT in 1960s creating a line in and a line out. And I'm sure this is probably deliberately reminiscent of what happens in the Matrix, right? What is their line out of the how do you get out of the Matrix? You've got to get on a phone, and I gather a cell phone isn't good enough. It's got to be hardwired to the I don't know if they if these days the wireless internet is now providing a way to get out of a simulation. People do say that if you really want to prevent AIs from getting out of a simulation, you've got to make sure they're not on the internet, and they do these things like air gaps. You got to make sure that run your simulation on an air gap machine that can't possibly communicate. Of course, air gapping was a lot more effective back in the days when all the communication on the internet was by wires. So the theological implications there run deep for our demiurge hacker gods. And then Hong was raising these questions about the universe being made of bits. Is it really made of bits? To which I say, well, it could be, but somewhat frustratingly, don't say it is. But I say that at least there's this analogous generalization of bits. If you think of like continuous bits, and that's roughly the idea that there's a level of mathematical structure under all of reality. And that's the somewhat generalized cousin of the idea that the universe is made of bits, which I think does have some chance of being true. Hong made the very fair point that when I say this idea is way out, the idea that the world is made of pure information or pure mathematics is rather obscure and hard to understand. So is everything else in the book. Totally fair point. Maybe I'm just reporting a psychological fact about myself. I find that view of the universe as grounded in bits and mathematics extremely appealing. But it's just one that I myself some days can't make sense of. Some days, sufficiently relaxed and expansive state of mind, all of the universe's bits, maybe it makes sense, but I'm still working on it.
Excellent, David. Thank you. All right, so that segment was on reality, and it's the precedes this segment that's on virtual reality. And so Shannon and then Bonnie and then Curtis are going to tackle this one. Shannon will lead us off with, do virtual reality headsets create reality?
I'm chapter 10, right? Where did chapter 9 go?
Yeah,
where did chapter 9 go?
We skipped chapter 9.
Oh, I see. Okay, I was surprised. Thought maybe I prepared the wrong chapter. Okay, good. So thanks, Ajay. Chapter 10 actually follows chapter 6 closely, with the central thesis being, while the virtual object is different from the non-virtual one, both are equally real. Virtual reality is a reality composed of bits rather than items. So why? First, define a virtual reality environment as an immersive, interactive, computer-generated space. Virtual object being digital objects corresponding to structured bits. Note, those are physical bits embodied in integrated circuits or other physical bases. And now recall 5 items on the reality checklist presented by Chris earlier. The first is X is real if it exists. Second, causal power. If you're real, you've got to have effects. Third, mind independence. Its existence shouldn't depend on our beliefs. Fourth, it cannot be an illusion. And fifth, the degree of genuineness or authenticity. So virtual reality at least gets 4 out of 5. By definition, the virtual objects we interact with exist in the computer system. So that fits with the existence. They are digital objects with causal powers that affects other digital objects and also users. We can take off the headsets and the virtual world continues without us. So mind independence. And they needn't be religions with, they needn't be illusions, an issue dealt with in the next chapter. But simply put, when you gain enough knowledge and expertise and become aware of the nature of things, virtual reality no longer needs to be an illusion. So the only debatable criterion is on genuineness. Embodied in the question, is a virtual chair a real chair? The key here is the inclusiveness of our current language. For example, though a virtual chair is not a genuine chair in the ordinary sense, a virtual library is a real library. This is because Chalmers contends chairs or cars and kittens are substrate dependent. What they are made of matters, whereas library of friendship captures how information and people are connected, and virtual world can replicate such connections perfectly well. So now think about how the definition of marriage is broadened over time in the real life. So it is very possible that our language might evolve to eventually count virtual chairs as genuine chairs, hence regarding virtual reality as 5 out of 5 on the checklist. So here's my question. Unless we take simulation hypothesis seriously, i.e. our reality may well be simulated reality, why would we prefer to make our language more virtual reality inclusive, rather than create distinctive words to capture supposedly different subjective experiences with VR? Wouldn't we be better off distinguishing VR experience and real life?
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. Bonnie will follow with the chapter 12. Does augmented reality lead to alternative facts?
Thanks. So I'd like to start by framing the question by looking at the definition. Augmented reality is defined as technology by which virtual objects are projected into the physical world. And that's distinguished from regular virtual reality, your run-of-the-mill virtual reality, in which the user is cut off from the physical world. So augmented reality is a mixed reality in which the user can see the physical world with virtual objects situated within it. For example, a virtual piano in Washington Square Park in New York. Dr. Chalmers applies his 5 criteria for reality to the piano and concludes that augmented reality is, for the most part, real. The illusion criterion gives him a moment of pause, but he ultimately concludes that so long as the user sees the piano as being virtually in the park rather than physically in the park, there is no illusion. So note here that there is a user issue in this analysis. There's also a systems issue. Dr. Chalmers speculates that there will be multiple dominant systems of augmented reality rather than a single universal reality. An Apple reality, Facebook reality, Google reality. Each corporation, he posits, will set up its own virtual worlds and augment them with its own virtual objects. It's this multiplicity of systems of augmented reality that gives rise to the question about alternative facts. What an Apple reality user sees may differ from what a Facebook reality user or a Google reality user sees. It also gives rise to questions about it also gives rise to questions about which reality is actually correct and has objective reality gone out the window? That's actually my favorite question. As well as a discussion of relativism, which Dr. Chalmers mentioned earlier in response to the first section of the book, which includes mention of Kellyanne Conway and Sean Spicer, which I hope is a bit of a teaser for people to pick it up and read. To find the answers to these questions, you will have to read the chapter, but suffice it to say, which is already mentioned, Dr. Chalmers posits that augmented reality is a harmless form of relativism that doesn't threaten the idea of objective reality. That is a proposition that I put to you as worth a CDL debate. Now, my primary takeaway, I'm obviously struck by the power that's going to be wielded by the owners of the dominant systems of augmented reality. What's to say, for example, that they're going to be corporations? Could we not have a Putin reality, a Bolsonaro reality, a Maduro reality, et cetera, et cetera? You get the picture. And I'm not certain that the idea of a single universal system isn't even more nervous-making than this idea of these dominant systems of augmented reality. I think there's another issue that's important, which is about this harmless form of relativism. I understand that's in relation to the idea of objective reality, but I think the example in the chapter about the Black Mirror episode tells us that all of this may not be quite as harmless as it may seem, on the surface.
Thank you, Bonnie. And to pick up on your Putin reality, Curtis is going to conclude this segment with, can we avoid being deceived by deepfakes?
Okay, so not exactly the intro I had, but so chapter 13 asks a pretty straightforward question. Can we avoid being deceived by deepfakes? And then the chapter starts off with a short story that actually describes how several of Professor Chalmers' friends and colleagues were actually deceived by a deepfake. So it kind of felt like after about a page and a half that this was an open and shut case. The rest of the chapter, though, then breaks down into 3 separate questions. Are deepfakes real? How can we know whether an image is real? And what about fake news? So within our deepfakes real section, Chris and a couple of others here earlier on in earlier chapters kind of gave a definition. This definition of virtual reality is slightly different, where the conclusion is ultimately standard deepfakes don't meet the 3 requirements, which would be computer generated, check mark, immersive, not quite, but seemed like it was a dotted line check mark is just a matter of time. And then where reality fell down, or it not being real, was it didn't meet the interactive test. I'd actually say, so the section concluded that deepfake Obama is not the real Obama, but it also notes that deepfake Obama is a real digital object. And I think it teases out the question of whether the interactive condition, can actually be met in the future. So it's kind of a not yet answer. The second section is, how can we know whether an image is real? And ultimately it was, look, they're bad deepfakes, they're out of context, poor video quality. If it's trying to replicate something real that we can all recognize, then humans will figure it out. But ultimately, this is a losing battle for humans as deepfake quality increases, which then dovetails into the third question, which is, what about fake news? It mentions fake news is not a new concept. I think we all agree that it's easier to actually spread fake news now than ever before. But it concludes, I'm not sure this is the good news section that Professor Chalmers mentioned a little bit earlier, but it does conclude that many people may be deceived about many things, but for a sufficiently critical subject, there will be limits. So at least it may not be the good news section, but at least there's a floor to the downside case. But I combine it with another passage that qualifies the likelihood of being deceived. And it says, it is often possible to determine whether news is fake or real by using the network of sources as a whole. And I guess the good news, bad news story for me when I was reading this is, it's resting upon a couple of pretty big assumptions, right? It assumes that we don't want to be deceived. And if we actually don't want to be deceived, that we have broad access or interest in accessing a network of sources. So, there's a Lincoln quote or attributed to Lincoln, you can't fool all the people all the time, but it seems clear to me anyway, and I think in this chapter that deepfakes will increasingly deceive all of the people some of the time, and probably some people all of the time, and we just don't know what the impact of that deception is.
Excellent, Curtis, thank you very much. So, David, any comments you'd like to make on the part 4 of real virtual reality?
Yeah, so I think of part 4 as well as part 5 and 6 as getting into I think parts 1, 2, and 3 I think of as really being about this very speculative idea, the simulation hypothesis, the idea that we might ourselves be in a virtual world. Part 4, 5, and 6 I think of as especially focusing on somewhat more practical questions, because here the focus is on the virtual worlds that we may end up creating. I label these now in my own mind. I should have done this in the book. The first theme is the matrix, that we're in a simulation. The second theme is the metaverse, the virtual worlds that we're going on to create, to label them by 2 famous virtual worlds from science fiction. And here in part 4, we're starting to get into questions about the virtual realities and augmented realities that we may create. I mean, it's not ultra practical. I'm still a philosopher after all, but these are actually about issues and systems that we're going to face in the coming decades. Shannon began by asking the very good question, where did chapter 9 go? Yeah, I guess we're doing 3 chapters in every part. So those parts with more lose one. Chapter 9 actually, no one reads it because it's a rather difficult chapter, but it's actually the chapter that really contains the arguments for my central thesis that virtual realities and especially simulated realities are genuine realities by putting together all the parts of the it from bit and the creator idea. And it also has some very cool illustrations. But Shannon is talking about the reality checklist and raises this interesting question. I talk about the idea that some of our concepts may become more inclusive over time. Maybe initially you use the word car just for a physical car, but maybe we might eventually use it for a virtual car as well. And I make a parallel with the way that the word marriage has become more inclusive. At one point, it just included same-sex marriages. Now it includes, at some point it just included different sex marriages. Now it includes same-sex marriages. The terms man and woman have become more inclusive. The term woman now includes trans women, and so on. And I think there's something similar that can go on with virtual reality. I don't think it has to, and I don't think that every word it needs to become inclusive in this way. Really, this is kind of a version of what philosophers call conceptual or linguistic engineering, changing our concepts over. Words are our servants, not our masters. I think we have the ability to tune our words to our purposes, and for some purposes, I think it's very clear that like a virtual class, let's say, like this, or a virtual seminar is very close to a physical seminar. Why bother differentiating